From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Today marks 10 years to the day when the U.S. invaded Iraq. On March 19th of 2003, I was in Kuwait waiting to cross the border. And since that day, I've been trying to heal from my experiences in the war. And I'm here today to demand accountability on behalf of Iraq veterans against the war and Afghanistan veterans against the war.
10 years ago, the U.S. invaded Iraq. We'll speak with former Army Sergeant Maggie Martin. She was in the invading force. And with Iraqi civilian Yanar Mohammed. Together, they've launched a campaign called The Right to Heal.
Iraqi women were not liberated by this war. At this point, socially, one man equals 4 women. Economically, one man equals 2 women. So women of Iraq were not liberated. And on top of that, we learned of a new epidemic that happened in Iraq called trafficking of women.
But first, we'll speak with investigative journalist Dar Jamal, who filed reports for Democracy Now! Throughout the war.
The consistent stories that I've been getting have been refugees describing phosphorus weapons, horribly burned bodies, fires that burn on people when they touch these weapons, and they're unable to extinguish the fires even after dumping large amounts of water on the people. Many people are reporting cluster bombs as well, and these are coming from different camps that I've been to, different people who've emerged from Fallujah anywhere from 1 week ago up to up towards near the very beginning of the siege.
That was 2004. Dar Jamal has just returned from Iraq once again, where he looked at the legacy of cancer and birth defects from U.S. munitions, torture under Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, and the million displaced Iraqi refugees still inside the country. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid has announced the proposed renewal of a ban on military assault rifles won't be included in pending gun control legislation due to a lack of support. On Tuesday, Reid told the bill's sponsor, Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, the ban does not have enough votes to overcome a filibuster.
Right now, her amendment, using the most optimistic numbers, has less than 40 votes. That's not 60. I have to get something on the floor so we can have votes on that issue and the other issues that I've talked about.
Opposition to the assault weapons ban has crossed partisan lines to include many Democrats. Although it won't be in the new gun control legislation, the ban could still come up for vote as an amendment. The toll from a series of bombings in Iraq on the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion stands at 65 dead and more than 200 wounded. It was the deadliest day of violence in Iraq this year. The group al-Qaeda in Iraq has claimed responsibility. President Obama has arrived in Israel for his first visit there since taking office. Obama will hold a joint news conference with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today, followed by talks with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in the occupied West Bank on Thursday. Obama will travel to the West Bank by helicopter, avoiding a drive through the Israeli separation barrier that carves up Palestinian land. As Obama arrived in Israel, the White House released his annual videotape message to the Iranian people on the Persian New Year of Nowruz. In his remarks, Obama said the onus is on the Iranian government to peacefully resolve the standoff over its nuclear activities.
If, as Iran's leaders say, their nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, then there is a basis for a practical solution. It's a solution that would give Iran access to peaceful nuclear energy while resolving once and for all the serious questions that the world has about the true nature of the Iranian nuclear program. The United States, alongside the rest of the international community, is ready to reach such a solution.
Both sides of Syria's conflict have accused the other of using chemical weapons in an attack in the city of Aleppo. At least 31 people were killed and more than 100 were reportedly wounded, including children. Both the Syrian government and rebel groups say they are investigating the incident. Previous claims of chemical attacks in Syria by both sides have not been substantiated. The Cyprus government is holding crisis talks today after lawmakers voted to reject a controversial bailout deal with the European Union. The package called on Cyprus to impose a one-time tax on bank deposits as a condition for $13 billion in rescue money. The plan led to protests and massive bank withdrawals over the weekend as Cypriots rushed to protect their savings. Cyprus says it's seeking an alternative to the plan, but few details have emerged. The government has warned of, quote, indescribable misery if a deal cannot be reached, including the collapse of the country's biggest banks. In Guatemala, a landmark trial is underway against former U.S.-backed dictator Fran Rios Montt on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. Rios Montt is charged in connection with the slaughter of more than 1,700 people during a scorched earth campaign purportedly aimed at rooting out guerrillas. He's the first head of state in the Americas to stand trial for genocide. On Tuesday, Nobel Peace Prize winner, indigenous activist Rigoberta Menchú welcomed the court proceedings.
It's a very big day for Guatemala. It's a very big day for those of us who have defended our lives in difficult circumstances, very painful circumstances of great isolation, of exile. It looks like our period of pain is ending because we hope that from now on we will be accepted by Guatemalan society, in our polarized society, the society that carries the burden of past genocide on their backs.
Rios Montt seized power in 1982 and his 17-month rule is seen as one of the bloodiest chapters in Guatemala's genocide. 7 U.S. Marines have been killed in an explosion at an Army munitions facility in Nevada. The Pentagon has ordered its forces around the world to ban the mortar rounds that caused the blast pending an investigation. The facility where the incident occurred is used to train special operations forces heading to the Middle East. The mortgage giant Freddie Mac has filed suit against more than a dozen banks for losses stemming from the manipulation of the global interest rate LIBOR. The rigging of LIBOR altered the benchmark for rates on trillions of dollars in transactions across the globe, meaning millions of borrowers paid the wrong amount on their loans. Along with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac's losses from the LIBOR scandal could top more than $3 billion. Freddie Mac's suit targets banks including Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Credit Suisse. The lawsuit accuses the firms of fixing LIBOR, quote, to hide their financial problems and to boost their profits. A new investigation says U.S. regulators have been quietly settling civil claims with banks whose failures triggered massive federal payouts and helped spur the financial meltdown. The Los Angeles Times reports the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has settled with the banks for a fraction of what their losses actually cost, while agreeing not to publicize the deals to protect the bank's public image. The FDIC has lost $92.5 billion in the failures of 471 U.S. banks since 2007. But the agency has collected just $787 million in settlements, a tiny fraction of its losses. While the settlements accuse the banks of fraud, negligence, reckless loans to homeowners, falsified documents, and other abuses, they've been concealed from the public under non-disclosure deals some say border on illegal. A new report says the New York Police Department is dedicating vast amounts of time and energy to arresting hundreds of thousands of people for the low-level misdemeanor of marijuana possession. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, from 2002 to 2012, under Democratic Mayor Michael Bloomberg, the NYPD spent more than 1 million hours of police officer time arresting roughly 440,000 people for marijuana possession. According to the report, quote, that's the equivalent of having 31 police officers working 8 hours a day, 365 days a year for 11 years, making only marijuana possession arrests. Critics of the city's marijuana arrest policy say it disproportionately targets people of color and diverts resources from more serious offenses. In other New York news, audio has emerged of NYPD officers confirming the use of quotas for making arrests and issuing summons. In recordings released by The Nation magazine, one officer is heard warning colleagues they'll be forced into patrols in order to meet the desired number of arrests.
The chief came in and I said, you know what, we really can't reduce crime much more. He said, what we can do, though, is get some of our people who aren't shipping in to go to some locations where we're having problems and give them the business, where rightfully they should. And that's all we're asking you to do. That's all. That's all. And if we do that and everyone chips in, it's fine. It's really non-negotiable. But if you don't do it now, I'm going to have you work with the boss to make sure it happens.
The Nation magazine says the audio recordings could be introduced in a class action lawsuit challenging racial profiling at the New York Police Department and the controversial policy of stop and frisk. South Carolina held primaries Tuesday for the state's 1st district congressional seat. Elizabeth Colbert Bush, the sister of comedian Stephen Colbert, won the Democratic nomination. The state's former governor, Mark Sanford, led the Republican field, advancing to a runoff vote early next month. Sanford's mounting a political comeback after leaving office under the cloud of a highly publicized extramarital affair in 2011. The website Gawker has published what it says is the private email address of former President George W. Bush on the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Bush's information was reportedly obtained by an online hacker who targeted a number of political figures. Gawker published the address under a headline reading, quote, "Wish George W. Bush a happy Iraq War Day. Here is his private email address." Appearing on CNN to discuss the Iraq War's 10th anniversary, the filmmaker Michael Moore called for the arrest and prosecution of President Bush and other top officials in his administration.
He's a war criminal, as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand why he, Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz are still walking the streets. The fact that no one has paid for this, this criminal act, why would an American such as George W. Bush send thousands of Americans off to their deaths? For what reason? And why doesn't he have to answer for that?
Oscar-winning filmmaker Michael Moore. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. On the 10th anniversary of the U.S.-led attack on Iraq, a series of deadly bomb blasts has hit the capital city of Baghdad. The first attack came early morning Tuesday and killed a finance ministry official. It was followed by more than a dozen bombings that targeted a vegetable market, a bank, and a restaurant. At least 65 people were killed and hundreds more were wounded. The spate of violence comes as many Iraqis are reflecting on what has changed in their country since the invasion, which led to the ouster of longtime leader Saddam Hussein. Many say they have yet to see any of the benefits they were promised.
The decision to go to war in Iraq was incorrect. Firstly, Iraq was put under Chapter 7. Then the war was waged. Nothing has changed in Iraq. There was Saddam's dictatorship before, but now there is a collective dictatorship in Iraq. What has changed in Iraq? The economic situation is very bad. The public services are in poor condition. Baghdad was flooded with water because of heavy rains. So the Americans always bring destruction and death in every place they go and invade.
The almost 9-year U.S. occupation of Iraq led to the deaths of at least 134,000 Iraqi civilians and contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands more. Many in Iraq continue to suffer the consequences of the invasion. Later, we'll also talk about the war's impact on U.S. military veterans. But first, we're joined by longtime Democracy Now! Contributor Dar Jamal, now an investigative reporter for Al Jazeera English in Doha. If you watched our coverage during the 10 years of the invasion, you will remember his reports from Fallujah and elsewhere. Dar recently returned to Baghdad, where he filed several major reports. His recent stories for Al Jazeera include Maliki's Iraq, rape, executions, and torture, and Iraq, war's legacy of cancer. He's also reported on the million displaced Iraqis who are struggling without government aid. Dar Jamal is the author of Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq, and The Will to Resist, Soldiers Who Refuse to Fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dar. It's good to have you with us. We last saw you when we were in Doha as well. That's where you are at the studios of Al Jazeera. Dar, talk about what you found in your most recent trip to Iraq.
It's a huge question, Amy, because the situation in Iraq today, 10 years after the U.S.-led invasion and occupation began. It's just utter devastation. It's a situation where overall we can say that Iraq is a failed state. The economy is in a state of crisis, perpetual crisis, that began far back with the institution of the 100 Bremer orders under the Coalition Provisional Authority, the civil government set up to run Iraq during the first year of the occupation. And it's been in crisis ever since. The average Iraqi is just barely getting by, and how can they get by when there's virtually no security across large swaths of the country to this day, where, you know, as we see in the headlines recently, even when there's not these dramatic, spectacular days of dozens of people being killed by bombs across Baghdad and other parts of Iraq, on any given day there's assassinations, there's detentions, there's abductions, and people being disappeared and kidnapped. One of the demands, for example, of the ongoing Sunni protests in Fallujah and across much of Al-Anbar province is to ban silencer weapons, as they describe them, because there's so many hidden executions happening. Iraq's basically become a lawless state where the government is laughingly referred to oftentimes as the sidewalks government, because one of the only things visible that they've actually accomplished is to install some new sidewalks across parts of Baghdad. But it's really hard to describe the amount of devastation. I mean, we're having to talk about a country where since 2003 began, we can cite the Lancet study that was published in the peer-reviewed Lancet Medical Journal in 2006, which way back at that time, 7 years ago now, found 655,000 excess deaths in Iraq, and that's now a grossly outdated study, particularly given the level of violence we saw in 2006, 2007, and the low-level chronic violence that perpetuates to this day.
And Jamal, a lot of people say that what's going on in Iraq now is not so much the result of the U.S. invasion, but rather sectarian war between Sunnis and Shias. Could you respond to that? Do you agree?
I don't agree. I think all of this is a direct result of either direct or indirectly a result of the U.S. invasion and occupation and the strategy applied. I mean, we saw something come out just last week in a joint investigation of BBC Arabic and The Guardian, which gave hard evidence, insider evidence of the machinations of the U.S. using a retired Lieutenant Colonel James Steele, infamous during the Reagan administration of orchestrating so many of the death squads in Central America, along with Negroponte. Well, Negroponte happened to be the U.S. ambassador to Iraq for some of the occupation, and of course brought in his old buddy James Steele to set up the same types of tactics, that the detentions, the types of torture techniques that we're seeing rampant across Iraq today, the blatant attempts to foment sectarian violence, sort of a divide and conquer policy. Even Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld under Bush, back around 2006, 2007, referred to kind of casually using the Salvador option in Iraq, and that's precisely what he was describing. So the sectarianism fomented, where, you know, we don't have a natural sectarianism or animosities between the sects in Iraq, but it was only after the occupation began and these strategies were applied by the Bush administration that we saw the violence, the purging in the mixed neighborhoods that continues to this day, and the sectarianism and basically turning Iraqis against one another very effectively. And this is a direct result of the Bush administration policy, as well as bringing in Maliki as prime minister himself. We have to remember that when neoconservative Zalmay Khalilzad was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Maliki was basically the guy that the U.S. government and Iran could agree with as having as prime minister, and so there wasn't a whole lot of democracy involved in that whatsoever. I say tongue-in-cheek. He was basically appointed by Zalmay Khalilzad and agreed upon by the powers that be in Iran, and he, of course, remains prime minister to this day, despite we've had elections that clearly he has not won, yet he remains in power.
Dar, I wanted to go to that Guardian BBC Arabic report that found that a key U.S. general behind the effort, James Steele, as you said, had first-hand knowledge of brutal torture carried out by Iraqi surrogates, but did nothing to stop it. Steele served as then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's liaison with Iraq's Special Police Commandos. His stint in Iraq came 20 years after overseeing the U.S. Special Operations Forces that trained government death squads in El Salvador. Speaking to The Guardian, an Iraqi general said Steele was unfaithful dazed when the torture of a young prisoner interrupted his lunch.
One of the detainees was screaming. By chance, James Steele was there, outside, washing his hands. He opened the door and saw the detainee. He was hanging by his legs, upside down. James Steele didn't react at all when he saw this man. It was just normal. He closed the door and came back to his seat in the advisor's room.
Steele was a colonel, Dar Jamal.
Well, he's a veteran of that kind of tactic. This goes way back to the 80s, all across Central America, which, you know, he clearly had plenty of opportunity to streamline his techniques. And that type of torture described in the clip that you just played is rampant. The story that I did, talking primarily about the tactics and strategies being used by Maliki security forces, and particularly within the prisons. First of all, we have a situation where detentions across Iraq, primarily in Sunni-dominated parts of Baghdad, as well as in areas like Fallujah, predominantly Sunni cities, where people are being detained en masse at times, nightly home raids, same type of stuff that the U.S. military used when they were in Iraq. And then the types of torture being described coming out of the prisons is truly horrific. People being hung by their ankles for days at a time while their heads are in buckets of water on the ground. People having their hands tied behind their backs and then hung from their hands for sometimes days at a time. Electrical shock being used on people's limbs, on their genitals, on their tongues. Men being raped by broom handles as well as bottles. Women in prison being raped. I spoke with one woman released just over a week ago at this point, talking about how she had been in prison for 4 years and was raped repeatedly by Iraqi forces. Other types of techniques being used, and again, all of this comes back to the types of workings of Colonel James Steele, whereas men are being threatened, and I interviewed several Iraqis who said this, that when they were detained, they said, look, they threatened me that if I didn't talk and give them the information they wanted or give them some names that would help them acquire the information that they wanted, that their sisters, their mothers, their wives would be brought in and raped repeatedly in front of them. So of course people would just start giving them anything that they thought they wanted to hear. But the types of torture is ongoing, it's rampant, it's one of the driving factors as to why we're seeing massive Friday protests now well into the 3-month across Al-Anbar province and the Adamiyah district of Baghdad, where Sunnis are demanding a halt for the detentions, a halt of the so-called Article 4, which is the legislation passed and being used in the Iraqi government that basically where they took a page out of the Bush playbook of giving them carte blanche to arrest anybody for any reasons under the guise of terrorism charges, of suspected terrorism, and then they can be held indefinitely. I spoke with people both at Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch about this, and they said one of the problems now is it's the detentions and the being held secretly is so rampant now by the Iraqi security forces that there isn't really even a need for secret prisons anymore. Remember a ways back it all came out that there were secret Maliki prisons. Well, now today in Iraq they're being referred to by a lot of Iraqis as secret prisoners, because people are being detained, the families aren't, there's no law requiring that the families be notified, nobody knows where these people are. They can be held in any prison anywhere in broad daylight because no name is being registered anywhere. So literally, we have untold numbers of people being detained, being treated horrifically. And as people in Fallujah have told me, they said, look, we think that the Maliki regime tactics are even worse than the Americans, because in the Americans, when they detained people, there was at least hope that they would eventually be released, and likelihood that they would. Under Maliki, that hope is gone. There's not a hope. The Fallujans also referred to as the Americans, therefore being at least somewhat more merciful than the tactics being employed by the Maliki regime, because people are being detained and not being heard from again, except in one instance, I interviewed the mother of a young man. He was 17 years old when he was detained. He was held for 1.5 years. They never could find him until she received a phone call from him saying, look, I've been a prisoner in these prisons, and I'm getting one last phone call to say goodbye to you, because tomorrow I'm going to be executed.
Dar Jamal, we're going to come back to you. Dar Jamal, investigative journalist, who's just returned from Iraq. He's speaking to us from Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with him in a minute. Nasser Sharma. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is Dar Jamal, investigative journalist who's just returned from Iraq, one of a handful of unembedded journalists who extensively covered the U.S.-led invasion in 2003, has spent a year reporting from Iraq between 2003 and the 10th anniversary of the war. His most recent stories for Al Jazeera include Maliki's Iraq rape, executions, and torture, and Iraq War's legacy of cancer. Nermeen?
Dar Jamal, one of the things that you mention in your recent reports is that the death penalty was reinstated in Iraq following the U.S. invasion. It was reinstated in 2005. And now Iraq has among the highest rates of death sentences in the world. Is that right?
That's right. The UN Special Rapporteur covering this topic has called, actually over a year ago, called for the Maliki administration to cease and desist all executions that are planned, because there's no due process happening in Iraq. There's no trials happening, basically kangaroo courts for some of those that are going to be executed and on death row. And absolutely, since the death penalty was reinstated, it's just been a flood of executions, and the current number of known people that the government admits to on death row is 3,000 people. Sometimes we're seeing as many as 12 to 20 executions on any given day. Non-Iraqi citizens have been executed, including people from Syria and Saudi Arabia. Women are being executed, as well as people who are under the age of 18. So it's clearly out of control. Human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, who I spoke with about this, have all called for a cessation of the ongoing executions that are happening, because really the Maliki government is just carrying these things out with impunity, so to speak. And so I contacted someone within the Iraq's Ministry of Justice, and the spokesperson, who basically said, look, if something happens in the United States, we see that there's so much outcry, like the crimes of 9/11, for example, there's so much outcry and people want to see people punished. And he said, why isn't the same for Iraq, was his justification. And in fact, he went on so far as to say, we have a right to do this. And in fact, I think that in order to bring more comfort to the families of the victims of crimes, we should have public hangings and public executions in Iraq.
Dar, I wanted to ask you about the issue of depleted uranium. In 2004, a special investigation by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez of the New York Daily News found 4 of 9 soldiers of the 442nd Military Police Company of the New York Army National Guard returning from Iraq tested positive for depleted uranium contamination. They were the first confirmed cases of inhaled depleted uranium exposure from the Iraq conflict. One of the people affected was Sergeant Augustin Matos, who was deployed in Iraq with the 442nd Military Police. Speaking on Democracy Now!, he described his health problems.
Well, I myself, while I was out there, experienced a fever one night, unexplained. I was fine during the day, and then it just hit me. It just totally knocked me out. I was in bed. I couldn't get out. I can't remember exactly what the fevers were, but also I was urinating blood while I was out there. It wasn't good. It was just a place not to be when you were sick like that.
That was Sergeant Augustin Matos. What did you find as you returned to Iraq this last time, Dar Jamal, about depleted uranium and its effect on Iraqis?
Overall, the country has seen a massive increase in cancer rates from the 1991 Gulf War up to present, even according to official Iraqi government statistics. In 1991, for example, there were 40 registered cases of cancer out of 100,000 Iraqis. By 1995, 4 years after that war, that number had jumped to 800 out of 100,000 Iraqis. And then
Dar,
by 2005, that number had doubled.
Dar, as you speak, I just want to say we're going to be showing images, and I want to warn our TV audience, for our radio listeners, if you want to go to the website, you'll be able to see the kind of images that you captured, Dar, when you were in Iraq. Go ahead. Keep saying what you were saying.
The most recent statistic I'll end with before I get into Fallujah and what these images are showing is that in 2005 we saw 1,600 Iraqis with cancer out of 100,000, so a massive escalation that continues. And going on to Fallujah, because I wrote about this a year ago and then I returned to the city again this trip, we are seeing an absolute crisis of congenital malformations of newborn. There is one doctor, a pediatrician named Dr. Samira Alani, working on this crisis in the city. She's the only person there registering cases, and she's seeing horrific birth defects. I mean, these are extremely hard to look at. They're extremely hard to bear witness to, but it's something that we all need to pay attention to because of the amount of depleted uranium used by the U.S. military during both of their brutal attacks on the city of 2004, as well as other toxic munitions like white phosphorus, among other things. And so what this has generated is from 2004 up to this day, we are seeing a rate of congenital malformations in the city of Fallujah that is surpassed even that in the aftermath of, in the wake of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were, that nuclear bombs were dropped on at the end of World War II. So Dr. Samir Alani actually visited with doctors in Japan, comparing statistics, and found that the amount of congenital malformations in Fallujah is 14 times greater than the same rate measured in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in the aftermath of the nuclear bombings. These types of birth defects, she said, there are types of congenital malformations that she said they don't even have medical terms for, that some of the things they're seeing they've never seen before. They're not in any of the books or any of the scientific literature that they have access to. She said it's common now in Fallujah for newborns to come out with massive multiple systemic defects, immune problems, massive central nervous system problems, massive heart problems, skeletal disorders, babies being born with two heads, babies being born with half of their internal organs outside of their bodies, cyclops babies literally with one eye, really horrific, nightmarish types of birth defects, and it is ongoing. And she, lastly, to really give you an idea of the scope of the problem, is that this is happening now at a massive rate, and she said her being the only person cataloging and registering cases with no help from Baghdad, who is denying that there's some sort of problem like this in Fallujah. She said that she could probably safely estimate that the number of cases as high as the rate that she's seeing could probably be doubled, because so many people are having their babies at home and just taking care of it. You know, most of these babies are being born dead, and then they're not reporting it whatsoever. So this is an ongoing crisis, and the rate has not increased since last year, but it's not decreased either. It was still, when I talked to her last year, it was 14 times a greater rate of malformations in newborns as compared to the aftermath areas of the nuclear bombings in Japan, and it's the same when I spoke with her about this 1 week ago.
Darjamal, do you know, has any U.S. government official ever publicly acknowledged that the U.S. used depleted uranium in Iraq? And what does international law say about the use of depleted uranium in wartime?
The Pentagon has admitted to using several hundred tons during the '91 Gulf War. It's hard to get official figures from them from this current, the most recent war, where certainly they've admitted that it was used, but it's figures range anywhere from another couple of hundred tons upwards to 800 tons. There's been no official statement that I've seen anyway from the Pentagon talking about the effects of these weapons either on the Iraqi civilian population or members of the U.S. military who use them, like the person in the clip that you played earlier. International law is very clear about these types of weapons. Any weapon that is known to have a lasting negative impact on the civilian population in the general area where it is used is technically a banned or a highly restricted weapon. And in this case, these types of weapons should not be allowed to be used. As I reported back in 2004 when it came out that white phosphorus was indeed being used in Fallujah, that's another restricted weapon where the Geneva Conventions state very clearly that if there are any possibility of any civilians in the area where it is going to be used, it is not allowed to be used. So the Geneva Conventions are very, very clear about these. And this brings up a broader point about the war. As we heard in an earlier clip from Michael Moore talking about the illegality of the war, it's good to hear this brought back into the discourse. Another individual, Robert Jensen, wrote an extremely poignant piece about the illegality of the war for Truth Out just yesterday. And I think it's important that we all remember on the anniversary that this was a war that violated the Geneva Convention. It is a crime against peace according to the Nuremberg principles, and all those responsible, Bush, Cheney, Wolfowitz, all the architects of the war, if the U.S. was indeed a member of the International Criminal Court, should be handled accordingly. And I think it's important that we remember the illegality of this, and that this continues, and that these crimes started 10 years ago that were perpetuated against the Iraqi people, that we see now most blatantly in these birth defects of these people in Fallujah, should never have even happened.
Dar, finally, the issue of internally displaced people in Iraq. You have the Iraqi refugees. How many left the country? How many remain inside? And where are they inside Iraq?
Well, at the height of the sectarian bloodletting in 2006-2007, there were over 4 million refugees, roughly half of them in the country, half of them who had fled the country largely to Syria and to Jordan. To this day, according to official Iraqi government statistics, there's 1.1 million internally displaced persons in Iraq. The majority of those are in Baghdad. Most of them have fled from sectarian cleansings of the aforementioned years and from the mixed neighborhoods where they had used to live, or the mixed villages, and into oftentimes primarily Sunni areas seeking refuge. So they're not getting really any help whatsoever from the government. They're living in horrible situations, and it was really a poignant thing to witness, Amy, because despite these people living in really difficult conditions, oftentimes living amongst giant piles of garbage, you walk in and, as per Iraqi Arab custom, you're offered a drink, although even in so many of these cases people only had literally a glass of water that they could offer you, despite the fact that they're living with no government assistance and help, and basically no hope for a future of where are we going to go from here. How is this situation in any way going to improve for us when things look so bleak, with a government in gridlock and it looking like we're poised for another massive increase in sectarian violence?
Finally, Dar, you were just in Iraq repeatedly on television, the corporate networks in the United States, but the U.S. got rid of Saddam Hussein, who was a tyrant. What is the feeling of people on the ground in Iraq?
Stunningly, as bad as things were under Saddam, and we have to keep in mind this perspective of Saddam in the wake of a brutal 8-year war with Iran, and then the genocidal sanctions for 13 years from 1991 up until the beginning of this invasion in March 2003. As bad as it was under Saddam, with the repression and the tensions and the torture and the killings, the overall feeling of Iraqis today in Baghdad and other places in Iraq where I went this trip was that things are much worse now. There's far less security. You don't really know where you can go and what you can do, and know that you're going to have any kind of safety. Anytime that we send our kids out to school now, is what I was told, we don't know for sure on any given day that they're going to come back. And so the prevailing sentiment is that yes, it was good initially to have Saddam removed, but People are still concerned with the basic things like security, an economy stable enough to be able to have a job, to work, to have food, and provide something for your family. And these things just no longer exist today in Iraq. So the prevailing sentiment is that it's far worse now even than it was under Saddam Hussein.
Dar, we want to thank you very much for joining us from the headquarters of Al Jazeera in Doha, Qatar. Dar Jamal, an investigative journalist, unembedded reporter, extensively covered the war in Iraq. You can see his reports through the 10 years on our website, on our Iraq War timeline. And we're joined right now by Democracy Now!'s own Renee Feltz, Democracy Now! Producer and reporter. Renee, you put together this timeline. Can you walk our viewers and listeners through it? What will they find if they go to democracynow.org?
Right. Well, Democracy Now! Has been around for more than 15 years. For 10 of those years, the nation's been at war. And we tried to encapsulate some of that coverage in a way that was easy for people to access and browse through. So if you go to our website, democracynow.org, go to the landing page there, you'll see a button where you can click on the timeline. Once you get into the timeline by clicking there, you can scroll through it and look at videos. It begins before the invasion, actually, on February 15th. A lot of people remember that millions took to the streets to protest. Despite that, the U.S. went to war. One of the interesting videos at the beginning is you, Amy, on Charlie Rose, doing a contentious interview, shall we say. You need to go to the website to see it. And it'll really help set the scene for the uniqueness of our coverage and bringing the voices of resistance, the voices of Iraqis. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can zoom in or zoom out, see all 10 years, just a few years. And if you move forward a little bit through that towards the end, bring us up to about 2012, when we recently covered a protest against NATO on Memorial Day by Iraq veterans against the war. And I know a lot of the Iraq veterans, like the ones we have coming up, were touched by that footage. A lot of people will find it very striking. We include voices throughout the timeline, like that of Iraq veteran Thomas Young, who we'll hopefully hear from later this week. He's been through many challenges. His story was featured in the Body of War documentary. So people should go to our website, democracynow.org. You can use the timeline to browse the highlights of our decade of coverage and watch the videos. It's all right there, very easy to watch. Now, if you click on the Read More link for each of the videos, what it'll do is take you to our landing page for that day. And so perhaps you want to see on some of the early shows all 2 hours of our coverage. Some days we went long. And you can see a very young Jeremy Scahill correspondent. He had just been back from Baghdad at that time in the early days of Democracy Now! And some of these shows. So it's great footage to watch. It takes you back to the time all the way up to the present. And it helps talk about the significant role that we played in the media landscape in this country in the lead up and during the war.
And Renee Feltz, thank you so much for putting this timeline together. It is truly priceless. It is a remarkable look at, well, how media, not on bended knee, can cover war. So go to democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, 2 women, one Iraqi, one a U.S. soldier, coming together to look forward, to heal. Stay with us.
This isn't for the ones who blindly follow jingoistic bumper stickers telling you to love it or leave it, and you'd better love Jesus and get out of the way of the red, white, and blue. This isn't for the ones who buy their 6-packs at the 7-Eleven where the clerk makes change, whose accent makes clear he sure ain't from here. They call him a camel jockey instead of his name. No, this is for the ones who stand their ground when the lines in the sand get deeper, when the whole world seems to be upside down and the shots being taken get cheaper. This isn't for the ones who would gladly swallow everything their leader would have them know.
On with the song. Mary Chapin Carpenter. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
On this 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, we turn now to look at how U.S. military veterans and Iraqi civilians are joining together to focus on the right to heal. That's the title of their new campaign, which was launched Tuesday in front of the White House. This is Iraq Veteran Against the War member Joyce Wagner.
In the U.S. military, it is estimated that 1 in 3 women will be raped during their time in service. I am one of 3. Many servicewomen who report rape to their commands face disbelief, retaliation, and various forms of humiliation that some have described as being as bad, if not worse, than the initial assault. Although most occupying troops have exited Iraq, the occupation has resulted in lasting struggles for Iraqi women. While I am unable to escape my own nightmares, I am able to live in relative physical comfort, unlikely to experience many of the things that are inescapable to those still living in Iraq. And while the Department of Defense and the VA have done an insufficient job at compensating and caring for U.S. service members victimized by their fellow service members in acts of sexual violence, they have done absolutely nothing to make reparation to victims of sexual violence in Iraq. How can I ask for justice for myself without first demanding justice for the many women in Iraq who were raped and otherwise abused in an occupation in which I participated? Today, as a part of the Right to Heal campaign, we demand acknowledgement, accountability, and reparation, and we will keep demanding these things until women on all sides of this conflict have had their justice and the world at large understands that sexual violence in the military and by the military is not an occupational hazard, it's a violation of human rights.
That was Iraq War veteran against the war, Joyce Wagner, speaking in front of the White House Tuesday. The group has just launched the Right to Heal campaign for Iraqi civilians and U.S. veterans who continue to struggle with the war's aftermath. For more, we're joined by 2 women helping to lead this effort. Inar Mohammed is president of the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, and Maggie Martin is director of organizing with Iraq Veterans Against the War. She deployed to Kuwait before the war and twice to Iraq in 2003 and 2005, left the military with an honorable discharge in 2006. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! I want to start by asking where you each were on that day when the U.S. invaded, March 19th in the United States, March 20th in Iraq. Maggie, where were you?
I was in Kuwait waiting to cross the border into Iraq.
And Yanar?
I had left Iraq after the first Gulf War and saw the attack on CNN and decided to go back because the wars on Iraq will never end by the U.S.
And how much time have you spent in Iraq since then? You live between Baghdad and Toronto, is that right?
Since 2003, I'm continuously in Iraq, but because many of us Iraqis have our families abroad, I go back and forth all the time.
And what do you see has happened in Iraq in these last 10 years?
It's just getting worse. We're again in a police state. We have armies, police, and all kinds of intelligence institutions around us. We have SWAT, we have anti-riot, it's all kinds of security institutions around us. And on top of that, I see the women in my country getting much weaker. I see an epidemic rise in certain kinds of birth defects, and when we try to organize women, we sent women from my organization to a town in Hawija. We were surprised to see hundreds of children that had birth disabilities. We see things in Iraq that we've never seen in our lives. I also see young women, orphans of war, female orphans of war, that are being trafficked, and the state absolutely has no obligation towards them. The young women who are being trafficked come to our organization and to our shelters. They don't even have the right to citizenship in Iraq. We're speaking here about tens of thousands of orphans of war who are absolutely not being taken care of. Neither the Iraqi government nor the U.S. experts in Iraq do anything about it.
Maggie, talk about the Right to Heal campaign.
It's really U.S. soldiers coming together with people from Iraq, civil society from Iraq, to say the struggle is connected. It's really a natural relationship for us to join together because we're dealing with the aftermath of the same invasion and long occupation. And I think that it's only right for U.S. service members to acknowledge the people of Iraq and Afghanistan as we're demanding our right to heal.
Well, how did your perception of the war change from the time that you first deployed to when you became involved in this campaign?
It really shifted dramatically just based on my interactions with the people in Iraq. Going there initially, I guess I believed the hype and the drop to the war and felt like we were doing something that was necessary for the safety of our country, and then hearing the story shift from weapons of mass destruction to liberation of the Iraqi people. That wasn't what I was seeing there. That's not what I was experiencing, and it really made me question the war.
Were other soldiers questioning the war?
Absolutely, and I think soldiers just don't necessarily feel like they have an outlet for that frustration, so spend a lot of time talking to each other about the situation, wondering why are we here, why are we making these sacrifices. The people in Iraq don't want us here, but I don't think they necessarily feel empowered to speak out publicly.
Maggie, we just saw one of the other women in Iraq Veterans Against the War speaking about rape and sexual abuse. Can you talk more about that personally?
Yeah, I mean, I experienced sexual assault from my now ex-husband about 2 days after coming home from my last deployment to Iraq, and I didn't report it. I didn't do anything about it because I didn't have any community outside of the military, and my community in the military, the people I worked for and I worked with, I didn't trust them. I didn't believe that I could get help, and I had also heard stories and rumors about other women who were raped, and the talk was always that it was their fault, that they were somehow in the wrong, and I just didn't feel like I fit into that category, so I was really in denial about the sexual assault.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the issues that women in particular face, both serving in the military and then as veterans?
Yeah, I mean, I think that not being seen as veterans, for instance, last night I went to a different show with one of my male counterparts, Alex, and we were both talking about the work that we do, and the man in the green room asked Alex, "Oh, are you actually a veteran?" But he didn't ask me. And I said, "Oh, well, just so you know, I am too." And so I think not acknowledging that, I think that not acknowledging the PTSD that comes from military sexual trauma, and then everyday you know, sexism and misogyny in the military is very strong.
Yanar Mohammed, what does Right to Heal mean to you as an Iraqi woman as you work together with U.S. soldiers like Maggie?
When Maggie is sent to Iraq or Kuwait and told to kill Iraqi people, or the original mission is about that, and we are there to receive the killings, we understand that the orders came from somewhere and that she is as much as a victim as us Iraqis. And as in the same situation, in the same token that we were put together and set as enemies against each other, we decide now that both of us are victims, and we're going to put hand in hand and try to heal from the sufferings that we had in the last decades. It's not only just one decade, but the Iraqi people, our lives, our futures have been devastated, and there is no compensation, no reparation in the Iraqi government or in the U.S. government. So our alternative now is to work together. We came back to, they brought me back to the U.S., and we're trying to work together as to holding the U.S. government responsible, accountable for what they did in Iraq and what they did to the Iraq veterans against war, I mean the veterans when they were in Iraq, and also to pay reparations to Iraq, just like they forced the Iraqi government to pay reparations to Kuwait. The U.S. government needs to be held accountable for the thousands of children who have come to life with no organs, with no limbs that are working, with a brain that is underdeveloped. The mothers, I met a mother in the town of Hawija who has 4 disabled children. Who's going to be responsible for her for the rest of her life?
As you mentioned, your organization, the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, has been documenting the toxic legacy of the U.S. military's presence in your country. I want to play a comment from a young mother in Hawija named Sosan. She describes how she spends much of her time caring for her young child, Mohammed, who is unable to use his limbs.
How old are you, Sasan?
My age is maybe 25 because I was born in 83.
Now you became 29 because I was born in 83.
Oh, yes.
And your son, what is his name and what does he have? Mohammed Mihad. He has a brain problem. His 4 limbs, they all have the same problem. I'm always carrying him. My back is tired. Who treats you? I've let myself go. Who takes care of you? Nobody takes care of me. He is 4 years old now, and I'm not becoming pregnant so that I can take care of him.
Yanar Mohammed, can you talk a little bit about the situation in Hawija, located for us in the country, and tell us how common this experience is elsewhere in the country as well?
In the town of Hawija is right next to a U.S. military base, what used to be a U.S. military base, and these people live only a few miles away from the field where there was daily ammunition training, and now we understand there's something called DU, and it was released in the air and the mothers were breathing it. In a town that has a population of 100,000, 109,000, we found 600 children who have the same birth defect, and some of the families who come from, let's say, religious backgrounds have decided that they cannot have children anymore. They're abstaining from getting children because they are living a big crisis and they have no solution for it, and the Iraqi government does not pay any social insurance for a handicapped or disabled baby, because our law, which was written in Saddam's time, says a child has to be over 12 years old to be paid any social insurance, and all these children are less than 10 years old. They were born in the times when there was ammunition training in that U.S. military base. So the mothers, hundreds of mothers in Hawija, absolutely have nobody to refer to, nobody to be responsible of them. And the children, some of them not only have lost their limbs and their brain, but they also lost their parents in the battles between the U.S. and the local people. So a kid who was called Ahmed, and he is in one of the pictures in the Right to Heal campaign, you can see it on the website, you will see that he had not only lost his limbs and his arms, he has nobody to take care of him. Both parents were killed. This is the legacy of the U.S. occupation on Iraq.
As we wrap up, Maggie and Yanar, are you both planning to go to Iraq together? And for people who listen and watch this right now, what do you want them to do?
Well, I hope that eventually I and other folks will be able to go to Iraq and work closely with our partners. I think that we're looking for public support to raise this issue and demand accountability to the U.S. government. People can visit our website. It's righttoheal.org. Veterans should visit ivaw.org, Iraq Veterans Against the War.
And you're not?
I feel that people need to support Iraqi people's right to reparation. The thousands of families who have the birth defects within their children, and the women who have been trafficked with no right to citizenship now, all of that needs to be addressed. And I also need, as an organization, we did this fact-finding mission, and now the Iraqi government has set us some conditions to be registered for our legality. They tell us you cannot shelter women, you cannot have political work. So this is the kind of democracy we have in Iraq.
Yanar Mohammed and Maggie Martin, I want to thank you both so much for being with us. Yanar is with the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq. Maggie Martin with Iraq Veterans Against the War. Together, they're part of the Right to Heal campaign. And that does it for this segment. Nermeen, I want to wish you good luck as you head off today to Hungary.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's right. I'll be going to Hungary to give a TED Talk in Budapest day after tomorrow.
And your subject?
I'm talking about some of the assumptions that we have about our political system and why perhaps now is the time to question them.
We are going to link to your speech as soon as they post it online. Have a very good talk in Budapest, Hungary. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Felsar-Mate, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff, Hani Massoud, Robbie Carandina, Guz Deremy, Littlefield, Martinez, DeRosta, Nemo Allen. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.